I would just like once again to welcome you to Designing with Native Plants. So this presentation that Scott is going to provide is introduces the core principles of sustainable landscape design using native plants that thrive in the local environment. So you'll learn how to create vibrant outdoor spaces that conserve water, reduce maintenance, support wildlife, and strengthen local ecosystems. So some of the key topics that Scott is going to cover include evaluating your site and understanding its unique conditions, watering and maintenance strategies for long-term success, selecting and arranging plants both for beauty and function, designing with habitat and pollinators in mind, and preparing soil and choosing materials that enhance a resilient native landscape. So as I mentioned, Scott and I have worked together for a long time here at Colorado Springs Utilities. And you'd be surprised, Scott is like a Renaissance man. He's got many talents, including water demand planning, but he has over 20 years of experience in water demand management with a background in public horticulture. Scott brings a unique blend of analytical expertise and horticultural insight. His specialties include high elevation, semi-arid landscapes, Western native plants, and rock gardens. Scott's passion for sustainable water practices and native plant design promise to make this a practical and informative session. All right, so why don't you go ahead and take it away, Scott, and we're excited to hear what you have to say.
All right, thanks, Catherine. I think one of my great skills is making people think that I have a lot of skills in different areas. So, it's the art of deception, I guess. So I'll go ahead and share this. I'm not going to beat around the bush too much since there's, plenty of slides here to go through. But like Catherine said, feel free to ask questions if you have them as we go along. I'm going to generally speak from my perspective, of course, as someone who has done a lot of landscape maintenance over the last 30 years. So some of my ideas here are really related to creating landscapes that thrive in the environment we live in, of course, but that are easier to maintain. So in some ways that will flavor some of my recommendations here as we go through. Thinking about this from a long-term sustainability standpoint is really the lens I'm looking at this through. And so we'll jump right in. So I won't go through the agenda since Catherine and I mentioned that already, but so generally talking about native plant landscapes, I don't have a very puritanical view of native plants. I have a little bit broader view than some folks do. When we're talking about native plants, a lot of times we talk about plants that are native to Colorado, and we kind of draw that boundary. I don't tend to do that myself. I think that a lot of plants that grow in New Mexico and West Texas are often better adapted to our environment especially the southern Front Range than a lot of the plants that grow, say in Pitkin County. So I think the definition of native that you want to use is appropriate, but that's how I think about it. What's locally native ideally is something that's really incorporated a lot, but there are plants that are really well adapted in places that are a little further away than the border of Colorado. So why native plants? This being the native grass working group, I don't know that this is the group that needs a lecture on why native plants are valuable. Obviously, a lot of wildlife benefits, pollinator benefits. Obviously, these plants are well adapted to our soils and our weather conditions and things like that. From a water conservation perspective, of course, there are a lot of benefits. This is, why Colorado Springs Utilities is interested in this topic. But reduce maintenance and reduce chemicals, that's kind of from a practical standpoint where I've always thought that this is the right approach. I think it provides a lot of maintenance benefits. A lot of folks aren't necessarily interested in being in the landscape maintenance business on a day-to-day basis in their homes, and in businesses, obviously that costs money. So it's important to reduce that if at all possible. My number one reason really is that this has been my passion since I was 22 years old and an idealistic young man. I think a sense of place is really, really important in the landscape. It is often overlooked, and most of our landscapes don't necessarily look like Colorado to me. So I really care a lot about a sense of place, and so I think our landscapes should be visually distinct from other parts of the country. So as with any landscape design, whether you're using native plants or not, when you get into the design process, knowing your site is critically important. Knowing the boundaries of your project, slopes and exposures and soil texture, what's existing, what's going to remain there, how much water is going to be used, how much maintenance is required. All those things are really important. So knowing the site, which includes kind of knowing your client or whoever is going to be taking care of this site, is critically important, and that should inform everything you do and sort of dictate all of your choices throughout this process. So this is not new to anything else. There are some important considerations for native plant landscapes that it's more important in some ways to consider your site to make those the appropriate choices with your native plants, and with how that plays out in terms of all of the maintenance and visual benefits you get out of the site later on. So preparing the ground, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It is critical to not shortcut this. Obviously a lot of native plants are not going to need soil amendments the same way that non-native plants might. But I've seen sometimes in some of these native plant projects, particularly where they're just putting down native grass seed, that soil preparation is often overlooked or shortcut a little bit. So compaction can be a problem. Sometimes the site's not even cleaned up properly. I've seen in projects where, because they're seeding native grasses in, there is this lack of attention to detail in that part of the process. And I think it's important to make sure you don't shortcut the soil preparation. Compaction is a real issue in particular when you're dealing with a site where there was just construction and there's a lot of issues there. And like I've said before, if you can find a small princess to do the work for you, all the better. So the critical design concepts that I want to talk about today, this is kind of the core of what I want to present. And I have a little bit different way of thinking about it than maybe what the status quo has been in landscape design in Colorado and most places. I'm really adamant that you need to think in terms of layers in the landscape, and that covering the ground. I think this is something that my coworkers, there are a few phrases that I use a lot in work that my coworkers make fun of me for. Covering the ground when it comes to the landscape is one of the things that I think people make fun of me for at this point. Let me guess, cover the ground. Yes, I've heard that before. So it's really important. I think and covering the ground with vegetation is really important. So if we look at a lot of the landscapes that are built today, obviously rock has become, and rock over fabric in particular, has become the a top choice for a lot of landscape designs for covering the ground. I think that's creating huge challenges for us in many ways. It creates challenges in terms of plant health, obviously in terms of weed maintenance over time. It's hugely costly. It's hot. Fabric is problematic in a variety of ways. And, it's just as a general way of thinking about this, covering the ground with vegetation is a much preferred approach in my opinion. And I think that's, something that I'll be talking about throughout this presentation. So um, what that has implications for some other choices you're going to make in terms of how this is irrigated and things like that as well. So covering the ground is critical. Uh, defining plant zones or plant communities, we can talk about those details here in a little bit too, but thinking about plant communities in Colorado, for example, things like prairie or meadow, woodlands, those kinds of things. That when you're working with native plants in a way we're emulating the natural environment. So those plant communities provide a basis for how we want to think about laying the landscape out. Massing and repetition is critically important in any landscape design. Those using masses of plants and repetition is important for creating cohesion and it's more visually pleasing, but it's critically important. It's even more important with a lot of native plants in the landscape, because some of the native plants, particularly the flowering native plants, can look a little wild, and if you don't use some design methods that make it more cohesive and calming in a sense, that wildness can get a little challenging for some of the clients you may be working with. I think people have certain expectations of what the landscape looks like, and we're trying to find a balance between two, natural or naturalistic and wild that satisfies most of our clients. So that's massing and repetition are critical for that. Planning for succession obviously is important in any landscape design as well. So succession of blooms and textures and forms so that you have interest year round. It also is important for maintenance activities and that sort of thing. But again, we're trying to emulate the natural environment. We can't replicate it. In this built environment, that has some implications for, how people are going to perceive it. So in my opinion, aiming for a more controlled, simplified version of a natural environment is important. So that's going to mean we simplify our choices a little bit. We think about how we're massing things and repeating things so that it does emulate that natural environment, but isn't aiming to replicate it. So again, the layers and drifts are really important. So if covering the ground is kind of the key to success in many ways, it's sort of laying the foundation. The way I tend to design is I start with the canopy layer, that structural layer first. The biggest plants first is how I think about it, because those kind of define your space in many ways. So I start with that structural layer, that sort of canopy layer, and work my way down to that ground cover layer or ground plane layer. But thinking in layers helps clarify in some ways the role your plants are playing in the landscape. And in my mind, it helps simplify the process of designing the landscape by clarifying these layers and what plants might make up those layers. So trees, large shrubs, are the starting point for me. Working down to large shrubs, smaller woody plants, where those may fit. And again, these larger layers, the taller layers, those are all defining your space and are critical to think through first, in my opinion. And then that base layer, particularly the grasses and the ground covers, are probably, in my opinion, in many ways, thinking about native plants and native gardens, are possibly the most important choice you'll make in this process, because that's what's going to set you up for that long-term success. You can always come in and replace a tree or add a few trees, but if you don't get that foundational layer, that ground cover layer right, it's going to be hard to fix that later. So covering the ground, when I talk about covering the ground, I'm talking, 90+% of the coverage is with vegetation of some sort. You're going to have areas where maybe that won't work or doesn't make sense, of course, and that needs to be considered, but the vast majority needs to be covered with vegetation, in my opinion. That influences your irrigation design. In my opinion, I am not a big fan of drip irrigation. It's used in practically every commercial design at this point. Having done this for 30 years, I know that drip irrigation can be really problematic from a maintenance perspective. It's not necessarily always installed to consider how plants mature and grow over time. And many times the plants that are on drip irrigation are not well adapted to the site, such that as they mature, that drip is going to actually adequately provide them water. So because you're aiming to cover the ground, spray irrigation, using rotors or spray heads is generally preferable, because you are planning for a landscape where the root system is basically occupying that entire area. So and in this environment as well, this question comes up a lot. What we're really aiming for from a water perspective, generally, and this is kind of my general rule, but it will vary depending on your specific goals. But in general, we do want to water the site. We have to water to establish, and we're looking for something like 1 day per week of watering to maintain a healthy, vigorous landscape that is competing with weeds, that is meeting the expectations of whomever the client or the owner of the site is. And that will vary, obviously, depending on weather conditions and that sort of thing. But generally, we're looking for something that's maybe a third as much water as a traditional lawn would get. That will vary. Like I said, you might have areas of, a little higher water use that, still native plants, but, plants that like a little extra water in smaller areas and that sort of thing. But that's a general rule of thumb there that I'm, generally promoting. In this environment on the Front Range, in a disturbed environment where you're trying to put something back in place, irrigation is critically important, but it's also important to make sure that you're planning it properly so that you're not using too much water. The grasses and shrubs should make up the majority of that. I'm showing in this picture, this is Denver Botanic Gardens native grasses, and this being the native grass working group. Hopefully I don't have to twist your arm too much to think native grasses should be that foundational plant material, that foundational vegetation. Especially in the Front Range, where we are really in a grassland much more than we are in the mountains. A lot of people think of us as a mountain community. We are more of a short grass prairie community here in Colorado Springs and throughout much of the Front Range. We have foothills environments that are maybe more appropriate for shrubs and things like that, but most of our areas are really ideally suited for native grasses, in my opinion. In this process, though, we want to aim for clarity and we want to simplify things for practical management purposes. So if we have so much variety in here and that we don't know what we're growing, we don't know what's supposed to be here, what's not supposed to be here, we don't know what a weed is, it's going to be really challenging from a maintenance perspective. So this is where my botanic garden background comes in, where you know, just practical day-to-day maintenance of a site is really important to think through. You know, sites all evolve over time, obviously, and you know, people have different ways of thinking about what's appropriate and not. But from a practical maintenance perspective, simplifying things so that you know what you're looking for, and what to manage and what not to manage out of the site is critically important. And in my opinion, without that density in the landscape, either weeds are going to be a major issue for you, or weed management is going to be a major issue for you. So if you're controlling the weeds, then you're kind of perpetually applying chemicals, or you know, having to manually remove weeds. And if you're not doing those activities, then you're going to have weeds, essentially, if you don't have the density to compete with those weeds. And in this process, we want the plants that we put in that are there purposely to play some role in that landscape. We want those plants to prevail, not the weeds. So thinking that through is critical, and that's why we want to cover the ground. So defining these planting zones, so the plant communities, so prairie or meadow, these can function as an alternative lawn, generally in sunny, relatively dry areas of the landscape, you know, is where a prairie or meadow is appropriate. And again, it could be a really simple alternative to a lawn. This probably should make up the majority of most of our landscapes, particularly larger landscapes. Now, if you get into a smaller landscape, it might end up being mostly a woodland, more of a woodland environment, especially if you have a lot of mature trees. When you get into mature trees, you know, grasses may not be your best option for covering the ground, and maybe shrubs at that point. So ground cover shrubs, you know, particularly in a small space, you might want more low growing shrubs, so it's not too overgrown looking, or you know, large shrubs can often become a little bit overwhelming in a small space. So keeping things relatively small and low growing to cover the ground is important. So when working with native plants, I like to think of what natural environments, what you know, plant communities are we trying to emulate, and then use those functionally to define the space and to cover the ground. So, you know, those shrubby areas, you know, obviously for screening purposes, for defining space, for understory areas that are shady, steep slopes often that may be too steep for grasses to perform successfully enough, you may move towards shrubs for those areas. And then bioswales, you know, obviously for decades now, drainage swales have been largely made up of river rock and things of that nature in many landscapes. And in some cases, you're going to see bioswales, but I really think these are great opportunities, particularly for native grasses. Many of the native grasses are pretty well adapted to these low-lying areas where water is flowing across the landscape. Obviously, these drainage swales using cobble, river rock, that kind of thing, those are challenging to maintain over time. You know, they're not comfortable spaces to walk through. They're challenging in a variety of ways. So moving toward vegetation is preferable in my opinion.
Hey, Scott, just as a
Yes.
time check, you got like 15, 20 more
15.
minutes.
Okay.
Yep.
We'll move fast here. So using massing and repetition, again, like I said, this is even more important for native plants, I think, than a lot of other landscapes. So large drifts, repeated clusters really help bring a lot of cohesion to the landscape. It can help simplify your plant palette a little bit as well, which can have some benefits from a maintenance perspective as well. And then this is mimicking natural communities as well. So if you look at a natural environment, you see lots of repeating drifts and clusters of plants naturally occurring. And so it is emulating that natural environment quite a bit. And it can provide a really stunning display as well at the times when those plants are blooming. So if you have, you know, 3 or 4 species, all of which are in masses and drifts and repeating clusters, that can get you a succession of blooms and textures throughout the season that can make the landscape really stunning throughout. I often see this is one of the biggest problems I see is people more impulsively buying plants, and they buy 1 or 2 or 3, and then they put them in, and there's no real rhyme or reason to it. It doesn't end up looking as good as it would look if there was a plan where many of those plants were used, or if those are the right plants for the site, obviously. But those masses really are what make a huge difference in the overall success visually of the landscape. And so I try to avoid buying the 1 or 2 or 3 plants at the garden center. I know I'm guilty of it, as guilty of it as anyone else when I see a plant I like, but you can have a few of those in the landscape, but in general, the masses are what's going to lead to more visual success over time. Again, succession of blooms, not just blooms, but textures. You know, I'm much more interested in form and texture as sort of the basis for the landscape design, as opposed to flowers. So flowers are really the last thing I think about. I know that's sort of blasphemous uh, to some folks, but I really want to think about what's covering the ground, what's the texture, what's the form, what does it look like when it's not blooming, so that then kind of once you've got that covered a little bit, then you're freed up to think more about the flowers, and the flowers are, you know, they're not having to do all of the hard work of, you know, creating that foundational aspect of your landscape. They're there to serve the pollinators and to provide splashes of color for periods of time. Then they can go away, and the next round of plants comes up and provides that splash of color or texture, depending on what the plant is. It also helps you think about uh, the establishment of the landscape. So succession of blooms year after year is one thing, but there is a succession to the establishment with some of these landscapes as well, particularly when using native grasses as your foundation. You may start a project by seeding in the native grasses without other plants, so that you get good establishment of those plants, and where you can see that anything that's not a grass coming up in that, for example, um, is likely a weed that needs to be managed. Once you've got that established, then you can come in with more forbs and flowers, maybe even shrubs and trees at a later point when you've got good establishment of that ground plane layer. So a succession of establishment is important to think through as well, particularly when using native grasses as the foundational element. And then there's a succession of maintenance also to think through. So again, we're talking about emulating rather than replicating. So this is not an environment that you're going to be able to replicate, obviously, but you can get to something that is very similar, that works extremely well. This landscape here is a hillside that was disturbed as part of construction. It looks to me like it's not irrigated at all. So this is probably a site that goes through a lot of different looks throughout the year. If it's a really dry year, it's probably a little crispy, but in a year like this, where we had a lot of rain early on, you're going to get something that really does look quite similar to what that natural environment looked like. So, you know, if this is something you're trying to emulate on a hillside, this is a really good choice. When these flowers are not in bloom, you might have something like this, where you have sort of your native grasses as a foundation, and where this may be mowed periodically. So this is kind of a way of thinking about emulating that natural environment without replicating it. So this is a managed landscape where you could have both the native grasses and some wildflowers in large drifts included in here. So plant characteristics, I'm going to go through a few of these here in a bit. So ground cover plants, we'll talk about specifically what those are and how those might be used. Structural plants, helping define space. Accent plants are those that you don't have maybe as many of, that really capture your attention. Maybe they have a form or structure that's year-round or evergreen. And then your seasonal interest plants are really your flowering plants. Those are the things that are feeding your pollinators and giving you those big splashes of color, and they're dynamic. So the ground cover plants, when I talk about ground cover plants, I'm talking about anything under about 3 foot tall, grasses and shrubs in particular, but there are other ground cover perennials as well. But essentially it's like a living mulch, essentially. So moving away from rock as a mulch, or rock over fabric, or even wood mulch, towards something that is living vegetation covering the ground, um, rather than a mulch or something else that needs to be maintained in a different way. So spreading shrubs can fill this role as well in areas sunny or shady. So this is you're controlling erosion, competing with weeds. In this layer, in my opinion, flowers are kind of a bonus, but not the primary purpose of this layer. This is your layer that's covering the ground. Structural plants, these are your shrubs, small to large shrubs that are defining space. They're breaking up the space a little bit, or they're maybe softening the architecture, or screening your neighbor, or screening the parking lot, those kinds of things. Defining space. They're maybe framing views, that kind of thing as well. And in this these kinds of plants, again, flowers, I think, are sort of a bonus. That's not the purpose of this. The structure is really the purpose of these plants, and the structure they provide and the purpose of these is to provide that structure. And if you get some flowers with it at certain times, all the better. But accent plants, obviously things like yucca are an example of something that's really architectural, sculptural almost, that are really providing that accent that is meant to be a show, maybe year-round, or at certain times, ideally year-round. These plants are really providing interest, and so they're strategically located, where you want someone's eye to be drawn, near an entrance, or to pull you through a pathway further down the road. So that's the purpose of these plants. Then seasonal interest. In my opinion, these plants, these flowering plants, where the primary purpose is that seasonal interest, generally flowers, these should make up no more than about 10 to 15% of the ground plane, essentially. So these are the plants that most people think about when they're designing a landscape, often as the flowering plants. In my opinion, they need to be kind of the icing on the cake, but not the whole cake. So many of these, especially native plants, a lot of them are short-lived. So some of them are long-lived and they bloom for a long time, but most native plants, penstemon are a good example, like this penstemon here. They're generally short-lived. They may naturalize, but you want to think of them as the plants. Those are the plants, once everything else is established and growing well, say this is your home landscape, your foundational plants are all taken care of and they're coming back year after year and they're doing their job. That kind of frees you up to go to plant sales and buy these plants as the things that are kind of really dynamic in your landscape. These are the things that are changing out. They're maybe living for 3 years and then going away. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That just gives you an opportunity to plant something else, and that brings that dynamic feel to the garden or to the landscape that you want. But if it's only comprising 10 to 15% of the landscape, or even less, that um, that short-lived nature of many of these plants is not going to be problematic. It's going to be hopefully fun. So I want to give you an example real quick of kind of a concept that I have for evolving the landscape, and I know we're about at time here. But so this is sort of the status quo in a residential front yard on the Front Range, particularly. This is Colorado Springs. A little postage stamp lawn that probably isn't used for a whole lot, with a few plants planted around it in rock mulch, almost certainly over fabric. This is the status quo here. I am sort of promoting an idea that would or could use exclusively native plants as an alternative to this. This is just a sketch. There aren't many of these out there, so I had to draw it instead of showing you a real one. But essentially, this would be something like buffalo grass or a buffalo blue grama that's mowed as an alternative to the Kentucky bluegrass that was in the status quo landscape. And because you're not using Kentucky bluegrass, you don't really need steel edging at this point. You can actually seed that buffalo grass, for example, throughout this whole area, and then plant a bed into that buffalo grass that is comprised of other native grasses, bunch grasses, like say, blonde ambition, blue grama, for example, ruby muley, the undaunted muley grass, and then a variety of native perennials could be planted into that as well. So you wouldn't need edging, you wouldn't need mulch, you wouldn't need fabric. You can irrigate this all on a single irrigation zone. And so it changes, some of the ways we think about some of the materials we're going to need, and the way we think about maintenance as well with that. So this is kind of the general idea. I do have an example here at the demonstration garden at Colorado Springs Utilities that's an example of what we're thinking about here. So it does have buffalo grass, the undaunted ruby muley, blonde ambition, blue grama grass, and some larger grasses in the back. This particular photo is about this time of year, and there aren't a lot of things blooming in this particular photo, but we're adding perennials to this for more seasonal flowers. And so this is sort of my concept for how many of our landscapes could be altered to incorporate more native plants to cover the ground, to provide that seasonal interest and really think differently about how we maintain the landscape as well. So this landscape, generally from a maintenance perspective, we mow everything in here once a year. In say early April, we'll mow all of this, and then it's just a little bit of weed control throughout the year, watering once a week, and then we mow the buffalo grass, I think 3 times a year or something, and that can vary depending on whatever the needs of the site or the owner of that site have. But
Hey, Scott, on
That's
this one,
yes,
sorry to interrupt. I was just, I think this is a great example. Could you, based on, I'm getting some themes from the chat, could you talk about how you installed this? So that might address some of what, and maybe
sure.
why you chose to install it the way you did.
Yeah, so this we basically started by seeding in the buffalo grass along this front side. So this was kind of seeded in swaths somewhat.
So maybe even if you back up a little bit, it was
Okay.
like
Okay.
all like demoed and then you put the
Right.
boulders in, right?
We'll
Okay.
start at the beginning. Okay. We'll
Yeah.
go further back.
Yeah.
All right.
2 steps back.
So this was a huge juniper prior to this. So big Pfister juniper had been there for years and years. And so that got ripped out. We were left with basically just a flat dirt patch that we needed to do something with. This was the concept we came up with. The entire front side of the garden here was being redone at the time, and these large sandstone boulders were a big part of that design. And to keep it kind of cohesive with the rest of this front area, the boulders were brought in and set in to provide that cohesion with the rest of the landscape in the front, and to provide just some interest in this garden, and incorporating rock is, in this environment in Colorado, incorporating rock, particularly if you have slopes and things like that, is a really important thing to think about doing. It really does add a lot of interest to the landscape structurally. So when everything is dormant, you still got some structure there of interest. Um, so that was the idea here. Those boulders were brought in. Um, the soil was tilled here. No amendments were brought in at all. So it was just tilled, and then we seeded in the buffalo grass along the edge, that front edge. Um, this area does, when we get downpours, water does flow across this area quite a bit, or at least it did before we had the vegetation in. The vegetation has really changed the way the water moves across this site, but at that time we had to use an erosion blanket on this to get it to establish well. So we did that. The upper area where the taller grasses are, we did seed that with blue grama grass, just a standard native blue grama grass seed was seeded in that area. We established the seed first, and once we got establishment of the seed, then we came in and we planted plants. So the Blonde Ambition blue grama grass, the undaunted muley grass, the taller grasses in the back, the big blue stem, and there are some other grasses like there's switch grasses and little blue stem, and I think an Indian grass snuck in there. I don't know that I planted that one, but it snuck in there. Uh, so all of those were planted, and so we planted it to you know
And when you say planted, you mean they were potted plants,
potted
right?
plants, potted plants. Yes,
And how long did
generally.
you let the seed germinate before you put in the potted plants? Like it was just a couple of weeks, right? Or a month or something. It wasn't like a
Yeah,
couple
it
years.
wasn't a long time. I think it
Yeah.
was, in general, I would recommend something like 2 months to get germination, and then some degree of establishment after that. So about a 2 month window, I think, is ideal for coming back in to plant into that. And we've added some plants over time as well. Of course, we seeded in some other wildflowers in there as well, and um, those didn't do a whole lot. And a few of them, I think, got sprayed by someone who was spraying for weeds early on. And so some of those didn't make it. So we ended up, the wildflowers that are there were all planted at this point. And we have a lot of things in there like we have butterfly weed. So at a certain time of year, earlier than when this picture was taken, we have a lot of butterfly weed blooming in here. We have tall coneflowers, we have lead plant, and a variety of other things planted in here. But everything that's in here can basically be treated as herbaceous. So we mow it all in the spring, and that's that was the idea here, was that this is not a woody plant landscape. This is all herbaceous plants. The lead plant is the one woody plant that's in there, but we mow that as well, and it's sort of is treated like a perennial essentially, and it works well in that with that treatment. So that was the idea. It really was pretty straightforward and simple in many ways. You know, no mulch used. It's just one irrigation zone. Um, and again, from a maintenance perspective, you know, I'll take a walk every couple of days and pull a couple of weeds, but generally there aren't a lot of weeds that come up in here, and the ones that do are quite small. So it does require some weed maintenance, but not anything dramatic, and it works quite well. So that's the concept. And I think we're at the end of time, but happy to answer any questions you have.
Yeah. Okay. So Scott, we've had quite a robust discussion, which is awesome.
All right, robust
Um,
I like.
yeah. Okay. Yes, and Carla said from all these great questions, we might need another session to answer them all. And I think it'd be great to get everyone's um discussion. But we'll do what we can. So a couple themes that we have. The first one I think is pretty important. Well, we have one about irrigation, which I think is really important, but let's tackle the one. There's this tension between introducing forbs in the seeding process or later on because you have weed control. And
Right,
then you have weed control on the one hand, right? And on the other hand, you have the need. I mean, if you plant forbs too late, they just are not going to compete with any native grass root systems. Like they just will
right,
never establish.
right.
So how do you navigate that tension between the need to do weed control and competition? And Scott, you could offer your perspective, and if anybody else has ideas, and then we'll tackle the irrigation question, and then we have fire, and also then the last one would be what are your top recommendations for spreading shrubs? So we're going to try to get through all that. So anybody has
Great.
ideas on the tension between weed control and introducing forbs and giving them a shot to compete with native grasses?
Yeah, so I think that 2-month window is really kind of ideal for planting a lot of forbs and shrubs and larger, you know, perennials. Uh, in the in this particular area, if you're planting directly into that buffalo grass, it's gonna be a bit of a struggle. But that area behind it, um, there are some openings in there because that was seeded very lightly, I would say, with the blue grama grass because we knew we were going to come back in. We really just wanted the blue grama grass to kind of fill space between where a lot of our plantings went in. So it wasn't a dense seeding of blue grama grass to begin with. So that's something to consider. But I think that 2-month window is important. Um, you could wait till the following season, but you know, and plant early, I think. But once you get past that window, you're going to start to struggle against the grass, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something to plan for, and that's that succession of planting that you need to think through. So if you know you want to have this sort of bed type look along the edge, you can think about how you seed that so that you maintain um, the ability to plant. So you're not um, over planting with the seed where you want to be able to put more forbs and things in. But if you do a full, you know, dense planting and you want that full coverage, know that you've got a smaller window of time probably to add things you might want. Now you could find other ways around that. You could cut out some of the grass, things like that, but that's a lot more work than most folks might be willing to do to get more shrubs and forbs, in particular the perennial flowering plants established in native grass. So
Yeah, that's a good
first
point.
recommendation is to keep the seeding a little thinner where you want those plants. And aim for that 2-month window. If you can't do that, that next spring is probably your next best option.
Yeah, and there's some discussion in the chat that is talking, and I agree with this, that if you want to intermix forbs, maybe just doing bunch grasses, and then if you want more of a solid ground cover where you're reducing weed competition, that's where you would work in your rhizomatous or your stoloniferous grasses.
Right. Yeah, and
Okay.
I lean heavily on bunch grasses. You know, I
Yeah.
probably like them more than most people, so uh, I don't have any problem having uh, just a lot of bunch grasses and a few other things. Other people might have a different perspective on that, so others can feel free to chime in on that for sure.
Okay, so Scott, I'm going to ask you for your top three, and then I would love to hear from other people about the irrigation issue. So Scott, what are your top three-ish spreading shrubs that you would use in these types of landscapes?
So Piney Butte sand cherry, probably like the Rolo sumac or the autumn amber sumac, depending on the situation. I do like those quite a bit. Then I for an evergreen, you know, it depends on um, how big you want it or how much water. I do think there are a variety of low growing, or I think a lot of them aren't as low growing as you might want. Maybe like the hillside creeper pine is one that if you want something a little bigger to cover a big area that doesn't have to be super low, um, that plant is amazing. Um, Obviously, it's not a native plant, but it is a large spreading shrub that will cover a lot of ground, and I think it's a really, really cool looking plant.
Okay, so you said Pawnee Buttes, you said Grollo sumac, and you said hillside creeper.
Yeah, and that autumn
Okay.
amber sumac is a good one too if you want it really low, which
Okay.
basically ground hugging. I also like the manzanitas quite a bit for an evergreen. I knew
Okay.
I was trying to think of another evergreen, but the manzanitas I like quite a bit.
Okay, sounds good. And then, so there's been some discussion in the chat about irrigation. And I think once again, it's like a tension thing between maintenance of drip irrigation and getting it to establish plants and have sufficient water needs over time versus overspray and plants blocking irrigation. And Scott
Right.
Hunt, if you don't mind, maybe just like talking about what you see and what your thoughts are on that topic, and anybody else who wants to chime in. Um, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
sure. So,
oh,
like from a design
go.
standpoint, if you're starting with a whole new area and you're doing a plant bed, say like the one in the picture there, I would start with like some 6-inch pop-ups on the outsides and stuff, and it's going to have enough of a rain curtain to clear most of the plants in that picture. And I think that one of the questions being kind of that rain shadow that can happen is that the spray is coming off the heads, maybe hitting a low hanging branch, and it's just dripping off the drip edge and not making it to the root zone. And I think that's where you want to keep those larger plants kind of centered in between heads and also raise trees a little bit to allow that coverage to come through as things grow. Um, but yeah, from a design standpoint and from a maintenance standpoint, I think that overhead spray beats drip by 100 times. And I just see that over and over again. I've been doing irrigation for 31 years, and drip irrigation has just always been a pain to install. It's a pain to maintain. You can't do system checks on it because you can't see it most of the time. It's subsurface or under fabric or whatever the case may be. You don't see what the problem is until a plant dies and etc. So that's kind of my short take on it. If there's any other questions, feel free.
This
Yeah.
Scott agrees with that, Scott, on all of those points. So yeah, planning your planting design to consider the spray heads, your rotors. Yeah, 6 inch if you're using buffalo grass in particular, 6 inch around the edges. 12 inch pop-ups are going to be really useful in a lot of areas as well. But your planting design has to consider irrigation sprinkler coverage. So
Okay, but this is like a dumb question for me maybe then. But you talked about layers, right? Like
mhm.
so, I mean, are you just looking at like every irrigation zone is like a pyramid where your tall plants are in the middle and then like,
it,
I
it
mean, or can you do like a layered thing where this is the back of the irrigation zone?
Modify, to have those different layers move and do different things within the landscape. You just have to design the irrigation to accommodate for that. So, maybe I've got some taller heads in other areas and smaller heads on the outsides, or, I don't want a 4 foot plant right on the perimeter of that sidewalk. And that's always going to be the case because it's going to block irrigation. And, if that's kind of the only thing that you want, if you're looking to put in a hedge of some sort or something right there, then maybe drip does make more sense in that area. But for the most part, I think irrigation design can accommodate for most things, overhead irrigation.
Yeah, if you look at this picture, for example, the tallest grasses are roughly halfway between two heads.
Yeah.
And we planted the shortest grasses around the heads, basically. So we did try to consider that in this planting design. So you may not notice it. You try to plant it so you don't really notice that, but uh, you do have to consider that.
Very cool. Okay, any other comments on the irrigation portion, or should we move on to fire? Okay, so if you have any more comments on irrigation, that'd be wonderful. But Scott, or anybody else, what do you all think with the emphasis on fire-wise landscape and fire resilient landscapes, particularly in, in Colorado in the wildland urban interface? How do these types of landscapes intersect with the need to have fire resilient landscapes?
That's a good question. I think the buffalo grass in particular is a really good option for those areas nearer to buildings. Blue grama can work in those areas as well, but I think in the recommendation generally is for those to be mowed before winter comes, which can really diminish the benefits of some of these plants if you did mow them. Um, if this were your landscape choice, this in theory to achieve this appearance would need to be and fully meet the firewise recommendations would need to be 30 feet from the building, which may not really be practical. Um, there are a lot of practical challenges with a landscape being completely firewise, but buffalo grass is a great option for that. Certainly to achieve the firewise objectives. If you're doing a buffalo grass blue grama mix as a large area, what I've found is, and I have this at my house in the backyard. So what I do is I tend to mow that in late August for the last time of the year. So if I mow it in late August, generally I get some growth coming back, but I don't get a lot of blooms, or if any blooms really on that are very tall with the blue grama grass. So, but it does allow it to kind of grow and fill in and become dense enough to get through the winter without thinning out. So if you mow that mix too late in the year, you might thin it out over time. But that mowing really does help you meet those firewise objectives. You just got to think about the timing of the mowing. With a landscape like this, it's going to be a little bit more challenging if you're within that 30-foot window around the building. Is this answering the questions we have, or do we have other questions?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. Like, so irrigate it to keep it green in the summer and then mow
Right,
it strategically when you need to in the fall. Okay.
right. And if you're in that wildland urban interface, obviously that needs to be a strong consideration in your design and how you think about that envelope around the building.
Okay. That sounds great. I think that that's most of the themes. I know we didn't get to every particular, okay, here's another one. I think this is another irrigation one. We'll close on this one, and I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's, but maybe Scott, you can stick around for a few extra minutes if people have additional questions they'd like to ask you. But Paula did say, how do you water established trees that require more water than native grasses? Do you put them on a separate spray or bubbler zone? What do you recommend? Or Scott Hunt, maybe this is a good question for you too.
Yeah, I'll let the other Scott try to answer this. See if I can get a different perspective from my own on this.
Yeah, so that's obviously been a pretty big concern of mine over the last year since I've been in the water conservation position and looking over our native conversions is we're seeing some decline in some of the trees just from some of the warm season grass conversions that we're trying to take down from 24 inches a year to 12 inches a year. And I'm personally seeing that that's not enough water for those trees. And forestry would definitely agree with me on that. So I'm leaning more towards like the 16 inches at this point, and Eric Becker may eventually argue with me about that, but that's where that conversation for me is going, is kind of finding a happy medium with putting down enough water for the trees and still maintaining a very healthy growth of native grasses, but not cutting the water back so bad that you're hurting, 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old trees in the process. And in parks, we have them everywhere. We kind of have to consider that. So my most recent native conversion is 1.8 acres, and I did a wheatgrass and fescue mix, which will take a little bit more water, but it makes a lot of sense for that site because it is just overwhelmed with extremely old and trees and a lot of shade.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like if you have existing trees that you want to keep because they're valuable and you don't have the opportunity to add additional irrigation, maybe that's where your ground cover choice really has to be matched to the tree's irrigation needs.
Yeah, and I think the zoning of the irrigation system needs to match that as well, if that's possible. It's not always going to be possible, but where it is possible, think about how you're zoning things as well.
Yeah. Yeah, if you can add drip for the trees alone, that's great. And in some of the large commercials and park settings, that's a very difficult thing to do after the fact. But if it's a new design or it's a residential, that may not be a big deal, and it may be absolutely something to consider.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, any last burning questions, comments, thoughts before we close out for today? Okay, well, thank you all so much. I'm going to send out a follow-up email with a recording of this presentation. I'll also send out all the recordings that we've done in 2025, so you have a library of things if you happen to miss one. Our planning team will be busy planning 2026, and we'd like to invite you back to join us. These are just super valuable sessions, particularly when we have people like Scott. Thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and expertise and your thoughts that you've developed over the past decade. So, and if you have an idea or a project that you would like to showcase, please reach out. We are looking for additional presenters for 2026. So don't be shy. Even if your project has a lot of learning opportunities, we would love to learn right alongside you. So with that, thanks everybody, and have a happy fall.
Thank you.